Chapter 81. The chamber gradually emptied as the officers left. Their footsteps echoing in the grand hall, General Nathaniel Warner lingered at the head of the table, his mind heavy with their recent discussions. He turned his gaze to the maps adorning the walls. His thoughts drawn to the broader implications of the Army Board's decisions, Warner straightened his uniform and walked to the window, where the sprawling training grounds of the United Army came into view. Soldiers drilled with rifles. Their movements precise and disciplined, the sight stirred a mix of pride and unease within him. These men relied on the board to ensure they were equipped with the best tools, possibly a responsibility Warner did not take lightly. His moment of solitude was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Major Theodore Calloway entered, carrying a leather-bound ledger. The younger officer saluted crisply before stepping closer. "General, I wanted to discuss the next steps for the proposal," Calloway said, his tone eager but measured. Warner nodded, gesturing for him to take a seat. "Go ahead, Major. What's on your mind?" Read exclusive content at NovelBin.com. Calloway opened the ledger and scanned his notes. "The phased deployment of the automatic gun needs careful consideration. I believe we should begin by equipping specialized units stationed in critical regions, particularly those along the southern frontier. That area is more likely to see engagements where suppressive firepower could turn the tide." Warner stroked his chin thoughtfully. "An excellent point, Major. The frontier garrisons often bear the brunt of skirmishes and border disputes. A demonstration of the automatic gun's capabilities in such a setting would provide valuable data." Calloway continued, "As for the bolt-action rifle, I propose starting with 2 divisions. A staged rollout will allow us to monitor its integration and address any unforeseen issues before scaling up. Additionally, we could offer incentives to Hesh Industries to prioritize production quotas." Warner arched an eyebrow. "Incentives? Elaborate." Calloway tapped his pen against the ledger. "Increased funding or tax reductions for meeting specific delivery milestones. It would ensure Hesh Industries maintains focus on our contracts while ramping up their manufacturing capacity." Warner leaned back in his chair, impressed by Calloway's strategic thinking. "It's a sound idea, Major. Draft a detailed plan, and present it to the board at the next session. Anything else?" Calloway hesitated briefly before speaking. "General, if I may, there's one more matter, the semi-automatic pistol. While its adoption is less contentious, I believe we should explore its potential beyond officer use." Warner's expression shifted, intrigued. "You think it has broader applications?" "Yes, sir," Calloway said. "Units like military police or scouts could benefit from its compact design and rapid-fire capability. It's more versatile than it's being given credit for." Warner nodded slowly, considering the suggestion. "You've made a compelling case, Major. I'll add that to the proposal now. Let's ensure these plans are airtight." As the evening descended over the capital, the Army Board's decisions began to ripple through the military hierarchy, in barracks and offices. Officers whispered about the revolutionary designs and the potential shift in strategy. They heralded. Speculation ran rampant about how these weapons might redefine the battlefield and the Republic's standing among other nations. At a secluded officers' club, Brigadier General Henry Caldwell and Lieutenant General Howard Grayson found themselves deep in conversation over glasses of brandy. The normally reserved Caldwell seemed animated, his enthusiasm evident. "I'll admit, Howard, I was skeptical at first," Caldwell said, swirling his drink. "But the possibilities are endless. That automatic gun alone could change how we approach sieges and defensive warfare." Grayson, ever the cynic, sipped his brandy and shook his head. "Possibilities don't win wars, Henry. Proven strategies and reliable logistics do. These weapons are impressive, yes, but they're also untested on the field. I worry we're putting too much faith in a gamble." Caldwell chuckled. "The future always seems like a gamble until it becomes the present. Do you think the men who first adopted rifled muskets or repeating rifles were any less cautious?" Grayson sighed, conceding the point. "Perhaps, but my concern lies with how quickly we're pushing for adoption. What if these weapons fail to meet expectations in the chaos of battle? Then we adapt," Caldwell said simply. "That's what we've always done." Their conversation was interrupted by Colonel James Whitaker, who approached their table with a grin. "Generals, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Colonel," Caldwell said, gesturing for him to sit. "Join us. We were just debating the merits of Mr. Hesh's designs." Whitaker chuckled as he took a seat. "Debating, were you?" "I'd wager Grayson's playing the devil's advocate." Grayson smirked but said nothing, letting Caldwell fill Whitaker in on their conversation. Whitaker listened intently before weighing in. Gentlemen, change is inevitable. What we've seen today represents the next step in that evolution. If we cling to outdated methods and equipment, we'll only make ourselves vulnerable to those who embrace progress. Grayson frowned. Progress isn't without risk, Colonel, and in war, risks can be costly. True, Whitaker conceded, but the greater risk is stagnation. These weapons give us an edge our enemies can't match, not yet. At least, if we don't seize this opportunity, someone else will. Grayson drained the last of his brandy, his expression grim. I only hope we're prepared for the consequences of that choice. Meanwhile, General Warner sat alone in his office, drafting the formal proposal to present to the Republic's War Ministry. His pen moved steadily across the parchment, outlining the phased deployment plans, cost analyses, and expected outcomes of adopting the Hesh Model 85 series. As he wrote, his thoughts returned to Matthew Hesh. The man was an enigma, brilliant, innovative, and enigmatic. Warner couldn't shake the feeling that Hesh's designs were more than mere ingenuity. There was a purpose behind them, one that extended beyond profit or prestige. Warner set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city's skyline. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing for certain. The great Republic of Amarathia was on the cusp of transformation, and Matthew Hesh's inventions were at the heart of it. With a resolute sigh, he returned to his work, determined to ensure that this transformation would strengthen the Republic, no matter the challenges it might bring. Chapter 82. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Republic's War Ministry as General Nathaniel Warner and Major Theodore Calloway approached its imposing stone facade. Soldiers stood at attention near the gates, their crisp uniforms reflecting the formality of the occasion. Inside, the sprawling complex housed the uppermost decision-makers of the great Republic of Amarathia's military leaders who would decide the fate of Matthew Hesh's revolutionary weapons. Warner and Calloway carried a stack of meticulously prepared documents and a leather case containing detailed blueprints of the Hesh Model 85 weapons. As they entered the main hall, the sound of their boots echoed across the polished marble floor. Are we ready for this, Major? Warner asked, his tone measured but firm. Yes, sir, Calloway replied. The proposal addresses every concern raised during the preliminary discussions. If they're willing to look at the numbers and consider the potential, they'll see that this is the logical path forward. Warner nodded, his sharp gaze fixed ahead. Let's hope they're as forward-thinking as you. They ascended a wide staircase leading to the meeting chamber. Two guards stationed outside opened the heavy oak doors, revealing a grand room dominated by a long table surrounded by the members of the Military Army Board. These were the men whose influence shaped the policies and future of the Republic's armed forces. Warner and Calloway saluted crisply before taking their seats at the head of the table. The room was filled with murmurs as the officers settled in, some exchanging glances while others reviewed their copies of the preliminary reports. Marshal Horatio Belmont, the chairman of the Military Army Board, tapped a gavel lightly against the table, calling the session to order. Belmont was an imposing figure, his sharp features and silver hair lending him an air of authority. He wasted no time. General Warner, Major Calloway, Belmont began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the chamber. You've come before this board to present a proposal concerning new weaponry demonstrated by Mr. Matthew Hesh. You may proceed. Warner stood, his presence commanding the room. Thank you, Marshal Belmont. Gentlemen, what we are about to discuss could fundamentally change the way the great Republic of Amarathia wages war. The Hesh Model 85 series, comprising a bolt-action rifle, an automatic gun, and a semi-automatic pistol, represents a leap forward in battlefield technology. He paused, letting his words settle. Our goal today is to provide a comprehensive overview of these weapons, their applications, and the strategies we propose for their integration. Major Calloway will begin by addressing the bolt-action rifle. Calloway rose, opening the leather case and laying out the blueprints. The Hesh Model 85 bolt-action rifle is designed for accuracy, durability, and ease of use. Its 5-round internal magazine and precise mechanism ensure consistent performance at ranges up to 500 yards. This rifle will provide our infantry with a decisive advantage in engagements requiring long-range precision. Colonel Everett Albright, known for his critical eye, leaned forward. Major Calloway, the range and accuracy are impressive, but what about production costs? Equipping our entire infantry force won't come cheap. Calloway nodded. That's true, Colonel. However, the simplicity of the rifle's design makes it ideal for mass production. Hesh Industries has already developed a streamlined manufacturing process, which will minimize expenses over time. Additionally, the rifle's durability will reduce the need for replacements, saving costs in the long run. Marshal Belmont glanced at the blueprints. And what about training? Will transitioning to this new model delay operational readiness? Calloway shook his head. Not significantly, sir. The rifle's design is intuitive, and our initial tests suggest that soldiers can achieve proficiency with minimal additional training. Belmont turned to Warner. Your thoughts, General? I've seen the rifle in action, Warner replied. Its performance speaks for itself. If adopted, it will raise the standard of our infantry and put us ahead of our rivals. Belmont nodded, gesturing for Calloway to continue. Next, we have the Hesh Model 85 automatic gun, Calloway said, unfolding another set of blueprints. This belt-fed, air-cooled machine gun is capable of sustained fire at 400 to 600 rounds per minute. Its quick-change barrel ensures reliability during prolonged engagements. Major General Frederick Mallory, a logistics expert, raised a hand. Sustained fire is valuable, but it also means higher ammunition consumption. How do you propose we address the strain on supply lines? Read new chapters at Novelbin. Calloway gestured to the blueprints. General Mallory, the phased deployment plan addresses this initially. The automatic gun will be issued to specialized units stationed in critical regions, where its impact can be maximized without overburdening our logistics over time. As production increases, we can expand its use. Brigadier General Caldwell, who had attended the initial demonstration, spoke up. Gentlemen, I've seen this weapon in action. Its potential to suppress enemy advances and secure defensive positions cannot be overstated with proper deployment. It will become a cornerstone of our strategy. The murmurs in the room grew louder as the officers exchanged opinions, some nodding in agreement while others remained skeptical. Marshal Belmont raised a hand to quiet the room. We'll address logistical concerns in the next session, Major Calloway. Continue. Calloway laid out the final blueprint. Lastly, the Hesh Model 85 semi-automatic pistol designed for officers and close-quarters combat. It offers quick follow-up shots and ease of use. Its compact frame and 7-round magazine make it a reliable sidearm. Colonel James Whitaker, a vocal advocate for modernization, leaned forward. I've reviewed the reports. This pistol is a clear improvement over the revolvers we currently issue. Its efficiency and reliability are exactly what we need. Lieutenant General Grayson, ever the skeptic, crossed his arms. It's a luxury, not a necessity. Officers have managed fine with revolvers for decades. Why change now? Whitaker countered. Because revolvers are outdated, General. This pistol gives our officers a tool that's faster and more reliable. Modern warfare demands modern solutions. The room quieted as Belmont surveyed the gathered officers. Gentlemen, you've heard the arguments. It's time to deliberate. We'll reconvene in 1 hour for a final vote. As the officers began their private discussions, Warner and Calloway exchanged a glance. The future of the Hesh Model 85 weapons and perhaps the Republic's military hung in the balance. Chapter 83. The air in the meeting chamber was heavy with anticipation as the officers of the United Army Board reconvened for the final vote. General Nathaniel Warner stood at the head of the table, flanked by his closest allies, Major Theodore Calloway and Brigadier General Henry Caldwell. The room had been buzzing with whispered debates and heated discussions during the recess, and now it was time to bring those conversations to a decisive conclusion. Marshal Horatio Belmont rapped his gavel lightly, silencing the murmurs and calling the meeting to order. His sharp gaze swept over the gathered officers as he adjusted his notes. Gentlemen, we've reviewed the proposals, debated their merits, and weighed the potential benefits against the risks. It is now time for the final vote on the adoption of the Hesh Model 85 weapons. General Warner, as the sponsor of this initiative, you may present your closing remarks. Warner rose from his seat, his commanding presence drawing the attention of everyone in the room. He took a moment to survey the faces of his colleagues before speaking. Gentlemen, Warner began, his voice steady. What we are discussing today is not just the adoption of new weaponry. It is the future of our military, the preservation of our sovereignty, and the lives of the soldiers who serve this great republic. The Hesh Model 85 series represents a leap forward in technology, offering us tools that can tip the balance in any conflict. He placed his hands on the table, leaning slightly forward. We cannot afford to cling to outdated methods and equipment while our adversaries evolve. These weapons are more than innovations, they are necessities. The rifle, the automatic gun, and the pistol each address specific gaps in our arsenal, and together, they provide us with a cohesive strategy for modern warfare. Warner straightened, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room. I understand the concerns raised during our discussions: cost, logistics, sustainability. These are valid points, and I do not dismiss them lightly, however. I believe we have the means and the resolve to overcome these challenges. This is a calculated risk, but it is a risk worth taking. Experience tales at Novel Bin. Calm, he gestured to the reports and blueprints spread across the table. The evidence is here, the demonstrations were conclusive, the potential advantages are undeniable. I urge you all to consider what is at stake, not just for our military, but for the future of our republic. Warner sat down, his words hanging in the air as the officers exchanged glances. Belmont nodded, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, General Warner. We will now proceed to the vote, starting with the Hesh Model 85 bolt-action rifle. Colonel James Whitaker was the first to speak. I vote in favor of adopting the rifle. Its accuracy and reliability are unmatched, and it is a clear improvement over our current standard issue. Brigadier General Caldwell quickly followed. I second Colonel Whitaker's vote. The rifle is practical, efficient, and essential for modernizing our infantry. Lieutenant General Grayson, however, hesitated before giving a reluctant nod. I remain cautious, but I cannot deny the rifle's performance. I vote in favor with the condition that we monitor its rollout carefully. One by one, the other officers cast their votes, the majority siding in favor of the rifle. Belmont tallied the results and announced the decision. The Hesh Model 85 bolt-action rifle is approved for phased adoption. Next, we will vote on the Hesh Model 85 automatic gun. This vote proved more contentious. Grayson, ever the skeptic, voiced his concerns once again. Gentlemen, while the automatic gun's capabilities are impressive, I must reiterate the strain it will place on our supply lines. I vote against its adoption until further logistical studies are conducted. Whitaker countered immediately. With respect, General Grayson, delaying this weapon's adoption could cost us strategic opportunities. I vote in favor with the recommendation that we prioritize its deployment to specialized units. The debate grew heated as the officers weighed in. Caldwell sided with Whitaker, while Major General Mallory, the logistics expert, proposed a compromise. I vote in favor of limited adoption. Let's start with elite units and gather data before committing to full-scale production. When the votes were tallied, the automatic gun narrowly passed with a conditional approval for phased deployment. Belmont's voice was firm as he recorded the decision. The Hesh Model 85 automatic gun will be adopted on a limited basis, subject to further evaluation. Finally, the room turned its attention to the Hesh Model 85 semi-automatic pistol. This vote proved to be the least divisive, with nearly unanimous support. Whitaker summed up the general sentiment. This pistol is a practical, modern sidearm that enhances our officers' effectiveness in the field. I see no reason to delay its adoption. Even Grayson, who had opposed the other weapons, nodded in agreement. It's a sensible upgrade. I vote in favor. Belmont's gavel came down with a decisive thud. The Hesh Model 85 semi-automatic pistol is approved for immediate adoption. The room fell silent as Belmont reviewed the final tallies. He folded his hands and addressed the board. Gentlemen, the decisions we've made today mark a turning point for the United Army. We have chosen to embrace innovation. Knowing that it comes with challenges and uncertainties, our task now is to implement these changes effectively and ensure they strengthen our forces. He turned to Warner. General, as the sponsor of this initiative, you will oversee the initial rollout of these weapons and report directly to this board. Are you prepared to take on this responsibility? Warner rose from his seat, his voice resolute. I am, Marshal. I will ensure these weapons are deployed and integrated effectively with full transparency to the board. Very well, Belmont said, standing to signal the end of the session. This meeting is adjourned. Dismissed. As the officers filed out of the chamber, Warner lingered for a moment, his thoughts already turning to the challenges ahead. The decisions made today would shape the future of the Republic's military, and he knew the path forward would not be easy. But as he stepped into the sunlight outside the War Ministry, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Chapter 84. The large oak doors of the War Ministry office creaked open, revealing General Nathaniel Warner and his two closest associates, Brigadier General Henry Caldwell and Major Theodore Calloway. The trio moved with a unified purpose. their boots echoing across the polished marble floor as they entered the spacious meeting room where Matthew Hesh waited alone. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall, arched windows, casting long shadows on the stone walls and bathing the room in a soft golden glow. Matthew stood near the center of the room, his hands in his pockets, posture relaxed but expectant. A long table stretched across the room with a decanter of water and empty glasses, though none of them seemed of interest to him. He turned as Warner entered. His expression calm and unreadable. "General Warner," Matthew greeted, inclining his head. His voice was polite but carried an undertone of curiosity. "You've kept me waiting. I trust you bring news." Warner offered a faint smile, but the general's face revealed little. His firm demeanor didn't crack, not even under Matthew's knowing gaze. He gestured to the chairs across the table. "Please, sit, Mr. Hesh," Warner said as he moved to the seat at the head of the table. Caldwell and Calloway followed, flanking him on either side. Matthew pulled a chair back and eased into it, eyes fixed on Warner. His calm confidence betrayed none of the anxiety he might have felt waiting for this moment. He watched the three men carefully, their serious expressions giving away little. Warner finally spoke. "Mr. Hesh, the Army Board has reached a decision." Matthew leaned forward slightly, interest flashing in his eyes, and the general's gaze met his squarely. "Your design, the Hesh Model 85 rifle, automatic gun, and semi-automatic pistol have all been approved for adoption." Matthew's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile, though his voice remained composed. "I see, that's good to hear." Caldwell chimed in, a touch more relaxed now that the news was out. "It wasn't an easy process, Mr. Hesh. There was strong debate, especially over the automatic gun, but the results of your demonstration spoke louder than the doubts. The rifle and pistol passed without issue, and the automatic gun has been approved for limited deployment." Matthew nodded, his expression showing no surprise. "It's not unexpected. Change rarely comes without resistance." Calloway spoke next, adjusting his notes in front of him. "The phased rollout will begin immediately. We're prioritizing select units on the southern frontier and elite divisions. You'll need to work closely with our logistics officers to ensure production schedules align with our needs." Matthew tapped a finger against the table, thinking it through. "Hesh Industries is ready. I've anticipated a staggered deployment. With the infrastructure we have in place, we can meet the initial demands efficiently." Warner leaned back slightly, his sharp gaze never leaving Matthew. "You seem confident, Mr. Hesh." "I wouldn't be here otherwise, General," Matthew replied smoothly. "I didn't design these weapons to sit idle on a drawing board. They were made to perform on the field, and I have no doubt they'll do exactly that." Warner studied him for a moment before continuing. "You'll have our full support, but let me make one thing clear, Mr. Hesh. This is no longer just about concepts and demonstrations. Lives will depend on these weapons, our soldiers' lives. Failure is not an option." Matthew's expression sobered slightly, his tone turning serious. "General, I understand the gravity of this situation. I've spent years perfecting these designs not for glory or fortune, but because I believe they can make a difference. I've seen what outdated technology costs on the battlefield: chaos, unnecessary deaths. These weapons are a solution. I'll personally ensure that every firearm produced meets the standards we've set." Calloway gave a small nod of approval. "That's reassuring to hear. Reliability will be key." The Army Board has also authorized field testing alongside the phased deployment. "Our commanders will report directly to General Warner regarding the weapon's performance." Matthew seemed unfazed. "That's acceptable. Feedback is invaluable. If there are flaws, well, fix them. Improvements can always be made." Caldwell interjected with a slight smile, breaking the tension. "I must admit, Mr. Hesh, you don't strike me as someone content to sit back and let others handle the details." "I don't," Matthew replied simply. "I've learned that leaving critical work in the hands of others without oversight is a sure path to disappointment." Warner glanced between his two associates before speaking again. "There's one more matter we need to discuss. The Army Board expects full transparency from Hesh Industries regarding production. Inspections will be conducted periodically." Matthew gave a slight nod. "Reasonable. You'll find no resistance from me as long as the Army fulfills its end of the contract. Hesh Industries will ensure the weapons are delivered on time and to specification." The general regarded him for another beat before rising to his feet. Signaling that the meeting was nearing its end, Caldwell and Calloway followed suit, and Matthew stood as well, pushing his chair back with an air of finality. "I'll have our liaison officer contact you within the day," Warner said, extending his hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Hesh, your designs are now a part of the United Army." Matthew took Warner's offered hand in a firm shake. "Thank you, General. You won't regret this decision." "I hope not," Warner replied, his voice carrying a note of stern resolve. Time will tell. Continue reading at Novelbin. Calm as Caldwell and Calloway exchanged parting words with Matthew, Warner moved to the door before leaving. He turned back to Matthew one last time. Make sure your factories are ready, Mr. Hesh, the future is watching. With that, the three military men exited the room. Leaving Matthew alone once more, he exhaled quietly, his expression shifting into a slight grin as he stepped to the window outside. The streets of New Hudson stretched endlessly, filled with people unaware of the change that was now underway. The future is watching indeed. He muttered to himself, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully in his mind. The gears were already turning production schedules, workforce assignments, supply chains, every detail laid out like a chessboard. The approval of his weapons was just the beginning. Matthew knew that this success marked a turning point not just for the United Army, but for Hesh Industries and the Great Republic of Amarathia, and if his designs performed as he expected, there would be no limit to what came next. Chapter 85. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the skyline of Sylvania warm hues of orange and crimson as Matthew Hesh stepped out of his office and onto the factory floor. The rhythmic clanging of machines and the low hum of activity filled the air, a familiar and comforting symphony of progress. Tonight, however, the factory would soon quiet, for celebration was in order. Matthew's boots echoed on the metal staircase as he descended toward the main production area. Workers, engineers, and foremen paused from their tasks, their curious gazes following him. Word had spread through whispers that the Army Board had met to discuss Hesh Industries' weapons, and anticipation had been mounting all day. Matthew arrived at the center of the floor, where a makeshift podium, a crate marked Model 85 rifles, stood waiting. He climbed on top of it, his sharp gaze sweeping across the crowd. Robert Anders, the factory's chief foreman, stood to the side, clipboard in hand and a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The workers began to gather closer, wiping grease from their hands and exchanging hushed murmurs. Matthew raised his hands for silence, and the room stilled almost instantly. The hiss of steam and distant clangs from idle machines became the only sounds. Ladies and gentlemen, Matthew began, his voice carrying easily across the vast floor. I've just come back from the War Ministry. I'm sure many of you have been wondering what the Army Board decided about our work. The crowd stiffened, breaths held in collective suspense. Matthew paused just long enough to let the tension hang before delivering the news. They approved it, he said, his voice calm but clear. All of the rifle, the automatic gun, and the pistol. The United Army is adopting our weapons. For a split second, the room was silent as the words registered. Then, like a dam breaking, cheers erupted from every corner of the factory. Shouts of excitement echoed through the space as workers clapped, slapped each other on the back, and whistled. Some threw their caps into the air, while others let out triumphant whoops that could be heard even outside the factory walls. Robert grinned, shaking his head in disbelief. We did it, by God, we really did it. Matthew smiled, his gaze sweeping over his team as they celebrated. He stepped down from the crate and raised his voice again. I want you all to know this victory belongs to every single one of you. Your hard work, your precision, your late nights, you made this happen. The crowd roared in approval, their pride evident on their grease-streaked faces. For many of these men and women, this wasn't just a job, it was a chance to contribute to something that could change the course of history. Explore more stories with Novelbin. Calm and to celebrate, Matthew added, raising his voice over the din. I'm taking you all out, drinks, food, the works on me. That set off another wave of cheers, even louder than before. A chant of Hesh, Hesh, Hesh started among the younger workers, spreading quickly across the floor. Matthew laughed and waved them off, motioning for Robert to take charge. Get everyone ready, Matthew said to Robert as the workers began to shuffle toward the doors. Well, head to the iron tap. It's big enough for this lot. Robert nodded, already barking orders to get the factory closed up for the evening. Workers exchanged tools for jackets and scarves, their excitement palpable as they made their way outside. Within half an hour, the factory floor had emptied, and Matthew found himself leading a procession of jeeps, wagons, and bicycles toward the heart of New Hudson. The Iron Tap was a sprawling tavern with high ceilings, brick walls, and sturdy oak tables. Its warm, golden light spilled onto the cobbled streets, drawing curious glances from passers-by as dozens of Hesh Industries workers poured inside. The owner, a burly man named Fergus, had known Matthew for years and welcomed him with a grin as wide as his beard. Mr. Hesh, Fergus called, wiping his hands on a rag. "I heard rumors, but it's true, isn't it? You've won over the army board." "It's true, Fergus," Matthew confirmed, clapping the man on the shoulder, "and tonight we celebrate. Put it all on my tab." Fergus laughed heartily. "Well, you're going to keep me in business for a year at this rate. Go on, then find your tables." The tavern quickly filled with noise as Matthew's workers claimed seats and shouted for pints, plates of roasted meats, and steaming loaves of bread. The air buzzed with conversation, the workers swapping stories about the factory, the weapons, and the future they were helping to shape. At a table near the center, Matthew sat with Robert and a handful of senior foremen. Fergus personally delivered a large round of drinks, setting them down with a wink. "You've earned it." "To Hesh Industries," Robert called, raising his mug high, "and to the man who made it happen, Matthew Hesh." A cheer erupted around their table and others in the tavern echoed it. Mugs clinked together and Matthew took a long drink, savoring the moment. He had spent countless nights planning, designing, and refining his weapons. Tonight was the reward for that labor, and he wasn't about to let it slip by. One of the foremen, a wiry man named Simon, leaned forward with a grin. "What's next, Mr. Hesh?" "The rifles are going to the army. What do we make after that?" Matthew set his mug down, his expression thoughtful but confident. "This is just the beginning, Simon. The army is stepping into a new age, and we'll be there to make sure they have what they need. Better weapons, better vehicles, better everything." "You really think this changes things?" another foreman, Henry, asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and awe. Matthew met his gaze squarely. "It already has. We're not just building guns, gentlemen, we're building the future." Robert raised his mug again, grinning from ear to ear. "To the future." "To the future," the table echoed, voices ringing loud and clear. Across the room, workers laughed, sang, and toasted one another, the sound of their celebration spilling into the night. Matthew watched them, a faint smile tugging at his lips. These people, his team, were the backbone of Hesh Industries. Their dedication had brought his ideas to life, and he would make sure they shared in every success. As the evening wore on, the noise in the tavern grew louder, the energy infectious. Fergus brought out rounds of whiskey, and someone in the corner began playing a raucous tune on a fiddle, prompting a few workers to clap along and stomp their boots. Matthew leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. He had accomplished what many thought impossible. His weapons had been approved by the United Army. The road ahead would be full of challenges. But tonight, none of that mattered. Chapter 86. March 6, 1886. The soft crackle of Matthew Hesh's fireplace filled his office as he pored over maps and old books. His gaze fell on a historical volume titled, "The Border Wars of Tagus, Amarathia and Mexico's Long Rivalry." He leaned back in his chair, flipping through the pages to remind himself of the conflict that had shaped two nations. The Grand Republic of Amarathia and the United States of Mexico had been at odds for decades. The trouble began years ago when settlers from Amarathia migrated into the region of Tagus, then a part of Mexico. The vast, fertile plains were a farmer's dream, and soon, thousands of settlers had established towns and communities. Mexico, already struggling with its vast borders and internal discontent, attempted to impose stricter control over Tagus, but the settlers resisted. In 1836, the people of Tagus declared their independence, driven by a mix of frontier spirit and defiance against Mexico's distant authority. When the Grand Republic of Amarathia accepted Tagus into the Union years later, Mexico saw it as a blatant theft. Ever since, bitterness had lingered. The two nations brokered uneasy truces, but the United States of Mexico never accepted the loss of Tagus. Border disputes flared from time to time, each incident fueling old resentments. Closing the book, Matthew muttered to himself, "Just like what happened in my previous world, but slightly different." The borderlands of Tagus were an unforgiving stretch of wilderness dotted with frontier towns and forts. In the dry afternoon heat, a column of Amarathian soldiers marched along a dusty road near the Rio Grande River, rifles slung over their shoulders. Their commander, Captain Elias Thornton, squinted toward the southern horizon. "Damn quiet today," Thornton muttered, the leather of his gloves creaking as he adjusted his hat. He didn't trust quiet days on the Tagus-Mexico border. The locals had reported increased Mexican troop movements on the other side of the river for weeks now, but so far, nothing had come of it. Nearby, Corporal Sam Harlow dismounted his horse and scanned the treeline. "Something doesn't feel right, Captain," he said under his breath. Thornton nodded in agreement. "Keep the men sharp. If they're out there, we'll see them soon enough." It started with a single shot. The report of a rifle echoed across the stillness of the riverbank. and a young private crumpled to the ground. Clutching his chest, Thornton spun around, bellowing orders, find adventures on Novelbin.com ambush. Take cover. Return fire. Mexican troops, wearing faded green uniforms, emerged from the treeline in force, their rifles cracking as they unleashed a hail of bullets. The Amorathian soldiers dove for cover, scrambling behind rocks and trees as the air filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Thornton ducked as a bullet whizzed past his head. Hold the line, damn it, he roared. He grabbed a rifle from a fallen man and fired back, the recoil jolting through his shoulder. Corporal Harlow shouted over the chaos. They're flanking us on the left. Thornton's heart sank as he spotted the Mexican troops moving to cut them off. The Amorathians were outnumbered, pinned down, and with no reinforcements in sight. After an hour of desperate fighting, Thornton knew the battle was lost. Fall back, he shouted. Back to the fort. The survivors scrambled to retreat, dragging wounded comrades with them. The Mexican forces, now in control of the skirmish site, let out triumphant cheers as the Amorathians retreated across the border. By the time the smoke cleared, 20 Amorathian soldiers lay dead, their bodies scattered along the riverbank like grim reminders of war. In the capital city of Colombia, the Grand Assembly Hall was packed with politicians, military leaders, and anxious journalists. President Theodore Clay stood at the podium, his stern expression reflected across the room. The assembly quieted as the president's deep voice filled the chamber. Fellow citizens of Amorathia, Clay began, his words steady. An unforgivable act of aggression has been committed against our nation yesterday. 20 brave Amorathian soldiers were ambushed and slain in cold blood along our border with Mexico. A murmur of anger rippled through the room. For too long, the United States of Mexico has tested our patience. Their refusal to accept the sovereignty of Tejas has brought us to this moment. We did not seek conflict, but conflict has been forced upon us. President Clay's voice grew louder, filled with conviction. As President of the Grand Republic, I will not allow these acts of violence to go unanswered. I have issued a formal declaration of war against the United States of Mexico. Our soldiers will march, our ships will sail, and this aggression will be met with the full strength of Amorathia. The hall erupted into cheers and applause, though the undercurrent of tension remained. Outside, crowds had already gathered, waving Amorathian flags and shouting patriotic slogans. The city echoed with the sound of marching boots. Drummers beating out rhythms as soldiers paraded through the streets in preparation for deployment. The next morning, Matthew sat in the corner of the Iron Tap, the familiar tavern now unusually quiet. A stack of newspapers lay in front of him, freshly delivered and still smelling of ink. The bold headline of the Sylvania Tribune dominated the page. War declared. President Clay calls for national unity. Matthew's eyes scanned the article, his heart pounding with each word. Reports of the border skirmish were detailed: 20 dead, dozens wounded, and the Mexican troops retreating just as quickly as they had struck. Robert Anders entered the tavern, his face grim as he joined Matthew. You've seen it, haven't you? Matthew nodded, his expression unreadable. War. Robert leaned back, exhaling sharply. They're saying the first wave of troops will move south by the end of the week. The army's going to need rifles, machine guns, everything we can give them. Matthew folded the paper and set it aside. Then we'll make sure they have it. Robert hesitated. Matt, this war, it's going to cost us in men, in resources, in everything. Are we ready for that? Matthew's gaze hardened, his mind already racing with plans. We have no choice, Robert. We're not just building weapons anymore, we're defending the Republic. Outside the tavern, church bells began to ring, their somber tones carried across the streets of Sylvania. War had arrived, and the factories of Hesh Industries would soon become the beating heart of Amorathia's war machine. Chapter 87. The factory floor at Hesh Industries roared with renewed purpose. The clang of hammers, the hum of engines, and the hiss of steam filled the air like an industrial symphony. Workers moved in coordinated chaos, tightening bolts, inspecting barrels, and preparing assembly lines to meet the sudden and immense demand for weapons. Matthew Hesh stood on the elevated platform overlooking the floor, his hands rested on the railing as his sharp gaze scanned the production lines below. Gone were the celebratory cheers from a week ago. What had once been a toast to success had turned into a fight for survival for the Republic itself. Robert climbed the stairs 2 steps at a time, a clipboard in his hand and a furrow of concern etched across his face. Sir, we've got the first figures from procurement. The Army's initial order came through this morning. Matthew turned to him, his expression serious. How much do they need? Robert adjusted his glasses, flipping to the top page of his notes. 50,000 Model 85 rifles, 500 automatic guns, and 20,000 pistols. They're prioritizing equipping the southern divisions and fort garrisons. They want the first shipments rolling out in 2 weeks. Matthew's brow furrowed slightly. 2 weeks. Robert nodded grimly. They're mobilizing fast. President Clay isn't wasting any time, and neither is the army. The generals know they're marching into a fight, and they want our weapons in their hands when they get there. Matthew exhaled sharply, his mind already calculating. Double the shifts, pay everyone overtime, make sure the foremen know there can't be a single flaw in these weapons. The last thing we need is for soldiers to find malfunctions in the field. Understood, Robert said, jotting notes on his clipboard. We've got the workforce, but raw materials are another problem. Steel shipments are already delayed from the northern mills. If this keeps up, it won't. Matthew interrupted, his voice firm. Send telegrams to the mills. Tell them he'll personally pay the premium for expedited shipments. If they can't keep up, we'll source the steel locally. Robert blinked, slightly surprised. That'll cost a fortune, Matt. I know, Robert. But the government is willing to pay us even more than what we are paying to our suppliers, so get to it. Robert gave a slow nod. I'll get the telegrams out immediately. The sharp, unexpected clatter of boots against the metal staircase made Matthew look up. At the far end of the platform, a soldier in Amarathian blue approached briskly, his uniform freshly pressed but dusted with dirt from the road. His presence brought the floor below to a brief hush as workers noticed the visitor. Mr. Hesh? The soldier called, snapping a salute as he came to a stop. Matthew straightened. That's me. Sir, I'm Corporal Harris from the War Ministry. General Nathaniel Warner has requested an immediate meeting with you in Columbia. He says it's urgent. Matthew's gaze narrowed slightly, though his expression remained calm. Did the general say what this was about? No, sir. Only that the situation on the southern border is escalating, and your presence is required to discuss matters of logistics and production. Matthew exchanged a glance with Robert, who was already scribbling notes. How soon do they need me there? The corporal straightened. Immediately, sir. I have a car waiting outside to take you to the train station. Matthew nodded. Tell the general he'll be there. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels against the tracks provided a steady backdrop as Matthew sat in a private car. The world outside whipping past in a blur. Fields of wheat and scattered farmsteads gave way to small towns, where stations were crowded with volunteers, soldiers, and citizens waving goodbye to loved ones already called to the front. Matthew watched through the window, the reality of war hitting him in ways the newspaper headlines never could. Boysome, not much older then. Teenagers stood proudly in new uniforms, rifles slung awkwardly over their shoulders. Mothers wept quietly in the shadows of the platforms, clinging to their sons' hands until they had no choice but to let go. Robert's words echoed in his mind. Find exclusive stories on Novelbin.com. This war is going to cost yous in men, in resources, in everything. The thought gnawed at him, but Matthew pushed it aside. There was no time for doubt now. His weapons had been chosen, and that meant countless soldiers would rely on him to ensure they had the tools to fight and return home alive. The War Ministry in Columbia was a fortress of authority and urgency. Soldiers and clerks bustled through its wide halls, carrying stacks of reports and orders. Matthew was led into a spacious office where General Nathaniel Warner waited, standing before a large map. Pinned to the wall, several other military officers were already gathered, their conversations halting as Matthew entered. Mr. Hesh, Warner greeted, striding forward to shake his hand firmly. I'm glad you came so quickly. I came as soon as I could, General, Matthew replied. I understand the situation is escalating. Warner gestured toward the map. We're receiving reports of Mexican forces amassing south of Tejas, larger than we initially estimated. Skirmishes like the one last week are only the beginning. Matthew studied the map closely. Red markers showed known Mexican positions, and clusters of blue markers represented Amarathian forces along the border. The scale of the challenge was clear. How can Hesh Industries help? Matthew asked without hesitation. Warner's piercing blue gaze met his. We need those weapons faster than you promised. The army will begin a full-scale advance within the month, and we can't afford delays. Matthew frowned slightly. I've already doubled production and guaranteed overtime, but if you're asking for more, I am. Warner interrupted. If you need more men, more steel, more coal name it, and well get it, the president has approved emergency powers to requisition whatever's necessary for the war effort. Matthew nodded slowly. They'll need more workers, additional forges, and a priority rail line for transporting finished weapons to the southern forts. Done, Warner said without hesitation. Anything else? Matthew's eyes narrowed. Tell your quartermasters to report back on how the weapons are performing. I want to know what's working and what's not. If something needs improving, I'll fix it fast. Warner allowed a small smile. That's why we trust you, Mr. Hesh. You're not just building weapons, you're building confidence. Chapter 88. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains near the border of Tejas. The United States of Mexico had gathered its 4 Caesar regiment of seasoned infantry bolstered by cavalry. Their banners fluttering in the gentle breeze, Colonel Alejandro Morales, a proud and battle-hardened leader, rode at the head of his column. His deep-set eyes scanned the landscape ahead, the barren expanse deceptively peaceful. Reports had indicated Amarathian troops stationed beyond the hills, and Morales was eager to press the attack. The Grand Republic's border skirmishes had emboldened him. Victory today would send a message that Mexico would no longer tolerate Amarathian encroachments into disputed territories. Well, show them. Morales muttered to himself, gripping the reins of his steed. His officers rode beside him, their expressions resolute. The infantry marched in formation, muskets resting on their shoulders, while the cavalry trotted confidently behind them. As they neared the crest of the hill, Morales raised a hand, signaling the column to halt. He dismounted, pulling out his telescope to survey the Amarathian position. A cluster of fortified positions and trenches dotted the plain below. Their arrangement orderly and precise. Morales furrowed his brow. This wasn't the haphazard defense he had encountered before. Their numbers are small, observed Captain Delgado, his second-in-command. Perhaps they've grown complacent. Or perhaps they've been reinforced, Morales replied, his tone cautious. We must proceed carefully. The colonel's gaze lingered on a peculiar object positioned in the Amarathian trenches. It was a bulky, unfamiliar contraption, its barrel glinting ominously in the sunlight. What is that? Delgado asked, following Morales' line of sight. I don't know, Morales admitted, his unease growing, but we'll find out soon enough. Morales returned to his horse and barked orders. Prepare for an assault, infantry to the front, cavalry on the flanks. We'll sweep them off this plain by noon. Cheers erupted among the troops as they moved into position. Drummers began their rhythmic cadence, urging the soldiers forward. Morales rode to the center of the formation, his sword drawn, leading the charge as the infantry surged down the hill. The Amarathian trenches were quiet, their soldiers calmly observing the advancing Mexican forces. Lieutenant Andrew Hayes adjusted the sights on his Hesh Model 85 bolt-action rifle, his steady hands betraying none of the tension in the air. Wait for it, Hayes said, his voice low but commanding. Around him, the Amarathian soldiers crouched behind sandbags, their fingers resting on the triggers of their rifles. Further down the line, a crew manned a Hesh Model 85 automatic gun, its belt-fed mechanism ready to unleash devastation. Through his scope, Hayes could see the Mexican infantry marching in disciplined rows, their muskets gleaming. He took a deep breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. Fire. A thunderous volley erupted from the trenches as the Amarathian rifle spat fire. Hayes' shot struck a Mexican officer square in the chest, sending him tumbling to the ground. The precision and range of the bolt-action rifles were unmatched, their bullets finding targets far beyond the effective range of the enemy muskets. The Mexican infantry faltered, confusion spreading as men fell before they could even see their attackers. Morales, still astride his horse, shouted orders to press forward. Close the distance. They can't hit us all. But the reality was far grimmer. The Amarathian soldiers maintained their disciplined fire, each shot picking off another man. The Mexican ranks wavered, their advance slowing as panic took hold, and then the machine gun opened fire. The roar of the Hesh Model 85 automatic gun shattered the already chaotic battlefield. Its rhythm was relentless, a staccato of death that echoed across the plains. The belt-fed weapons spat out a steady stream of bullets, tearing through the advancing Mexican infantry with ruthless efficiency. Men fell in droves, their bodies crumpling to the ground before they could even see the trenches. Ahead, Colonel Morales watched in stunned horror as his formation disintegrated under the onslaught. The neat rows of disciplined soldiers he had led down the hill were now a chaotic mass of wounded and dying men. Some attempted to return fire with their muskets, but the distance was too great, their antiquated weapons no match for the precision and range of the Amarathian rifles. Keep moving, Morales bellowed, desperation creeping into his voice. Push forward. But his cries fell on deaf ears. The Mexican infantry, facing an invisible wall of firepower, began to hesitate, panic rippled through their ranks, and the steady advance turned into a stumbling retreat. Morales turned to his officers, his face etched with disbelief. "What is this madness?" he muttered, his grip tightening on his sword. To his left, Captain Delgado struggled to maintain order. "Colonel, we can't get close enough to engage. Their weapons, whatever they are, make it impossible." Morales knew they had to change tactics, and fast. He turned to the cavalry, his voice rising above the din of battle. "Cavalry, charge the flanks. Break their line." The horsemen surged forward, their sabers glinting in the sunlight. Dust rose in thick clouds as the cavalry thundered across the plains, their war cries echoing. Morales watched, hope flickering in his chest. The speed and ferocity of the charge could overwhelm even the most fortified positions, or so he thought. The Amarathian gunners shifted their aim, the machine gun roared again, its deadly sweep cutting through the cavalry like a scythe through wheat. Horses screamed and toppled. Their riders thrown violently to the ground, the charging line fragmented, men and beasts falling in heaps, sabers clattered uselessly as the survivors scrambled to retreat, their charge shattered before it even reached the trenches. Morales' hope turned to despair. His forces were being slaughtered, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He turned to Delgado, his voice trembling with rage and frustration. "Pull them back. Fall back to the ridge." Delgado nodded, his face pale as he relayed the order. The remnants of the Mexican regiment began a disorganized retreat, stumbling over the bodies of their fallen comrades as they fled back toward the safety of the hill from the Amarathian trenches. Lieutenant Hayes watched the retreat through his scope, his heart was heavy as he surveyed the carnage. "Hold fire," he ordered, lowering his rifle. Around him, the gunners ceased their relentless barrage, allowing the battlefield to fall eerily. Silent, Hayes stood and looked out over the plain, now littered with the dead and dying. The smell of gunpowder and blood hung in the air. His men exchanged weary glances, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling over them. "Lieutenant," one of the privates said hesitantly, "do you think they'll come back?" Hayes shook his head, his expression grim. "Not today, they've seen enough." Back on the ridge, Colonel Morales slumped in his saddle, his sword dangling limply at his side. Around him, his officers gathered, their faces etched with disbelief and fear. "They knew," Morales murmured, his voice barely audible, "they knew we'd come. And they were ready." Captain Delgado placed a hand on his shoulder, his tone somber. "This isn't like any battle we've fought before, Colonel. Their weapons, we couldn't even reach them." Morales closed his eyes, his mind racing. He had underestimated the Amarathians, and it had cost him dearly, but he also knew this was far from over. The United States of Mexico would not back down. Not after today. They would regroup, rethink their strategy, and find a way to counter this new threat. Read new adventures at Novelbin. For now, though, all he could do was retreat and count his losses. "Order the withdrawal," Morales said quietly. "We need to return to camp and report this massacre." Chapter 89. Lieutenant Andrew Hayes stood atop a ridge overlooking the battlefield, his sharp gaze focused on the fleeing remnants of the Mexican army. Around him, his men reloaded their rifles and checked their gear, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Lieutenant," Sergeant Caldwell approached, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "Orders from command were to advance south and secure the territory beyond the border." Hayes nodded, his expression grim. "Very well, gather the men and prepare to move out. Leave the wounded in care of the medics. We'll send for reinforcements to evacuate them." Caldwell saluted and hurried off to relay the orders. Hayes turned to the horizon where the faint outline of the Rio Grande marked the dividing line between Amarathia and Mexico. Beyond it lay enemy territory, hostile lands they were now tasked with pacifying. As the Amarathian column crossed the Rio Grande, the mood among the soldiers shifted. There was an air of grim resolve, an understanding that they were no longer defending their homeland but taking the fight to the enemy. The clanking of supply wagons and the rhythmic march of boots created a steady, ominous cadence. Hayes rode at the front of the column, his rifle slung across his back and his eyes scanning the horizon. Scouts had reported a string of Mexican outposts and garrisons scattered across the borderlands, targets that needed to be neutralized to secure their advance. Their first objective was a small outpost nestled within a dusty valley. It was a modest fortification, its adobe walls weathered and crumbling, but it housed a contingent of Mexican soldiers tasked with guarding the approach to a nearby town. Hayes called a halt as the Amarathian forces came within sight of the outpost. "Position the machine gun crews on the ridgeline," Hayes ordered. Pointing to a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, "Infantry will advance from the east, using the dry creek bed as cover. No quarter for armed resistance." The men nodded, moving quickly to carry out his instructions. Within minutes, the Amarathian forces were in position, their rifles trained on the unsuspecting outpost below. The first shots rang out with deadly precision. Amarathian sharpshooters picked off the Mexican sentries atop the walls, their bodies slumping silently to the ground. The Hesh Model 85 automatic gun roared to life next, its bullets tearing through the adobe walls and sending the defenders into chaos. "Advance!" Hayes shouted, signaling the infantry to move in. The Amarathian soldiers surged forward, their disciplined formations contrasting sharply with the disorganized defense of the Mexican garrison. Muskets flared from behind the walls. But the defenders were outmatched. The Amarathian bolt-action rifles allowed their troops to maintain a steady rate of fire, picking off targets with lethal accuracy. Within minutes, the outpost was overrun. The surviving Mexican soldiers, realizing the futility of their resistance, dropped their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Hayes strode through the smoldering ruins of the outpost, his boots kicking up dust as he surveyed the carnage. "Secure the prisoners," he ordered, his tone cold. "Patch up any of ours who are wounded. We move on in an hour." Their next objective was San Ignacio, a modest town that served as a supply hub for the Mexican military. Scouts reported that a small garrison was stationed there, along with stockpiles of food and ammunition. The Amarathian forces reached the outskirts of the town under the cover of night, their approach masked by the rolling hills. Hayes called a halt, gathering his officers for a quick briefing. "San Ignacio isn't heavily fortified, but we need to strike quickly before they can organize a defense. Machine guns will cover the main road while the infantry flanks the town from both sides. No one leaves until we secure the area." The officers nodded, their expressions grim. They knew what was coming: another bloody engagement in a war that was rapidly escalating. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the Amarathians launched their assault. The machine guns opened fire on the garrison, shredding the defenders as they scrambled to man their posts. The infantry swept through the streets, their rifles barking with precision as they cleared buildings one by one. Civilians screamed and fled, their cries mixing with the gunfire and the shouts of soldiers. Hayes moved with his men, his rifle at the ready. As they pushed deeper into the town, he kicked open a door, finding a group of Mexican soldiers huddled inside. They raised their hands in surrender, their faces pale with fear. "Disarm them and take them to the square," Hayes ordered. "Make sure they don't have anything hidden." By mid-morning, San Ignacio was firmly in Amarathian hands. The garrison had been wiped out, and the town's resources were being cataloged and secured. Hayes stood in the town square, watching as his men worked methodically to consolidate their gains. "Lieutenant," Caldwell approached, his face lined with exhaustion. "We've secured the ammunition stores and found enough food to supply the regiment for weeks." Hayes nodded. "Good work, Sergeant. Make sure everything is accounted for. We can't afford any mistakes. This weapon of ours sure is rewriting the rules of war. Continue your adventure with Novelbin." "Com." Sergeant Caldwell nodded grimly. "We're fighting a different kind of war, Lieutenant. It's not about numbers anymore. It's about who has the better tools, and we have them." A distant rumble echoed across the horizon, drawing their attention to the southern edge of the town. The horizon remained empty, but he knew better than to trust appearances. "Keep the men sharp," Hayes said, his tone firm. "We've hit them hard, but they'll regroup. This isn't over." Caldwell saluted and moved off to relay the orders, leaving Hayes alone in the square. The lieutenant took a deep breath, the acrid smell of gunpowder still lingering in the air. He adjusted his rifle strap and glanced toward the church steeple towering over San Ignacio. Hayes turned and made his way toward the command tent, where a map of the region lay spread across a makeshift table. The push south was far from complete, and the next phase of the campaign loomed ahead. For now, though, San Ignacio was there's a foothold in enemy territory, which is also now their forward operating base. Chapter 90. The midday sun bore down mercilessly on San Ignacio as the Amarathian forces solidified their control. Lieutenant Andrew Hayes stood in the command tent, tracing his finger along the map spread out before him. Each line represented a potential route deeper into Mexican territory, each marker a known enemy garrison or supply hub. The town was quiet for now, but Hayes knew the reprieve wouldn't last. "Sergeant Caldwell," Hayes called, his voice steady but firm. Caldwell entered the tent, his uniform smudged with dust and sweat. "Yes, sir." Hayes straightened, his hands still resting on the map. "We've received new orders from command. The push south is to continue immediately. Our next target is the garrison at Villa Roja." Caldwell frowned, leaning over the map to inspect the location. "Villa Roja fortified town, about 12 miles south of here. Reports say it's heavily defended." "Exactly. Hayes said, his tone matter-of-fact. If we take it, we cripple their ability to launch a counteroffensive in this region. Command wants it secured within 2 days. Caldwell nodded, his expression resolute. Understood, sir. What's the plan? Hayes tapped the map, outlining his strategy. We'll split the regiment. The main force will advance along the road, drawing their attention meanwhile. A flanking unit will move through this ravine to approach from the east. Once the main force engages their defenses, the flanking unit will hit them from behind. Caldwell grinned faintly. Divide and conquer. Classic move. Hayes nodded, his expression grim. We'll need to execute it perfectly. If they catch on, we'll be the ones trapped. By late afternoon, the Amarathian column was on the move. Soldiers marched in disciplined formations, their boots kicking up clouds of dust along the winding road. Automobiles creaked under the weight of ammunition and provisions, while scouts rode ahead, scanning the terrain for any signs of ambush. The distant outline of Villa Roja came into view as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Hayes halted the column just out of sight of the town, signaling for his officers to join him. Lieutenant Bishop, Hayes said, addressing the leader of the flanking unit. You'll take 40 men through the ravine, move quietly and position yourselves here. He pointed to a spot on the map east of the town. Wait for my signal before engaging. Bishop saluted sharply. Understood, sir. As Bishop and his men broke off from the main column, Hayes turned to the rest of the regiment. Prepare for battle, he ordered, his voice carrying over the ranks. This won't be easy, but we have the tools and the training. Trust in your weapons and in each other. The soldiers nodded, their expressions a mix of determination and apprehension. They had seen the power of their new weapons firsthand, but they also knew the enemy would not go down without a fight. The Amarathian main force advanced cautiously, their machine guns positioned to cover the road leading into Villa Roja. The Mexican defenders spotted their approach and raised the alarm, the sound of bells ringing out across the town. From his position at the front, Hayes watched as the enemy garrison scrambled to man the walls. Muskets and old cannons were wheeled into place, their crews working frantically to prepare for the impending assault. Steady, Hayes muttered, raising a hand to signal his men to hold their fire. The first shots came from the Mexican defenders, their muskets cracking as puffs of smoke erupted along the walls. The bullets fell short, landing harmlessly in the dirt. Hayes smirked grimly. They were already outmatched. Machine guns suppressing fire, he barked. The Hesh Model 85 automatic guns roared to life, their deafening chatter echoing across the plain. Bullets tore into the walls of Villa Roja, splintering adobe and sending defenders scrambling for cover. The Amarathian infantry advanced steadily behind the suppressing fire, their bolt-action rifles picking off any soldier foolish enough to show themselves. Inside the town, chaos reigned. Colonel Javier Ortega, the Mexican officer in charge, shouted orders in a desperate attempt to rally his men. Continue your adventure at Navalbin. Hold the line. Reinforce the gate. But his words were drowned out by the relentless gunfire. The defenders' antiquated muskets were no match for the precision and firepower of the Amarathian rifles. Every volley from the walls was met with devastating accuracy from the advancing troops. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Bishop's flanking unit reached their position undetected from the cover of the ravine. They could see the eastern side of the town, where the defenses were weaker. Bishop signaled his men to prepare for the assault. Remember, Bishop whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant gunfire. Wait for the signal. The signal came moments later. A flare fired into the sky from Hayes' position. Bishop raised his hand, and his men surged forward, scaling the low walls with practiced ease. The defenders, already stretched thin, were caught completely off guard. The Amarathian soldiers moved swiftly through the eastern sector of Villa Roja, their rifles cutting down any resistance within minutes. They had secured a foothold inside the town and began pushing toward the central plaza back at the main gate. Hayes watched as the defenders' fire began to falter. The combined pressure from the main force and the flanking unit was taking its toll. He raised his rifle and fired, the shot dropping a Mexican officer who was attempting to rally his men. Push forward, Hayes shouted. Take the gate. The Amarathian infantry surged ahead, their bayonets fixed as they stormed the weakened defenses. The machine guns fell silent, their crews packing up to join the advance. The gate fell quickly, and the Amarathians poured into the town, their discipline and firepower overwhelming the remaining defenders. Colonel Ortega, realizing the battle was lost, ordered his men to retreat, but with the flanking unit cutting off their escape, most of the garrison was either killed or captured by nightfall. Villa Roja was under Amarathian control. Hayes stood in the central plaza, his uniform streaked with dirt and sweat, as his men secured the town. "Lieutenant," Caldwell approached, his expression weary but satisfied. "The town is ours. We've taken about 50 prisoners and secured a significant stockpile of ammunition." Hayes nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Good work, Sergeant. Get the men some rest. We move again at first light." Caldwell saluted and turned to carry out the orders.